I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing each of these people, but everyone here knows that Sam is the author of the bestseller, The End of Faith, Religion, Terror, and the Future of Reasoning, and also A Letter to a Christian Nation. He's completing a doctorate in neuroscience. Well, I'm not going to go on. His work appears everywhere. He was the winner of the 2005 Penn Award for nonfiction. His books are being translated all over the world, and he's just become a major force in our country in challenging the religious right and so forth. And Chris Hedges is probably the leading American war correspondent of the last, I don't know, 100 years or something. He studied at the Harvard Divinity School. He's written a number of very important books. He was a finalist. His book you probably know best, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for nonfiction. He was part of the 202 team at the New York Times that won a Pulitzer Prize for covering terrorism, and he received the 202 Amnesty International Global Award for Human Rights Journalism. And his most recent book is American Fascist, the Christian Right, and the War on America, which we've kind of been cannibalizing on Truthdig. But tonight you should go buy their books outside and help them out. So we're going to begin with you, Sam Harris. And I'm not going to ring a bell or anything. Just do your spiel, and then he'll do his, and we'll mix it up, take a few questions, and...
Great. Well, thank you, Robert. I think I'm bound to offend somebody in this room because we're living in a country where 90% of people claim to believe in a biblical God. I just want to assure you up front that I'm not being deliberately provocative. The point is not to offend you, and it's certainly not the point of my books. I'm just extremely worried about the role that religion is playing in our world. I happen to think faith-based religion is the most divisive and dangerous ideology we have ever concocted. It keeps me awake at night. Now, as someone who has been doing this for a while, ever since September 11th, ever since those 19 guys showed our pious nation just how socially beneficial religious certainty can be, I have argued against the role that religion is playing in our societies. And I've come to see that really there are only three ways of rising to the defense of God. There are not 100 ways of doing this. Either a person argues that a specific religion is true, or he argues that religion in general is useful, and so useful that it may be necessary. Or he attacks atheism essentially as another religion, as being dogmatic, intolerant, irrational, or otherwise worthy of contempt. And so I want to separate these three modes of defending religion because any conversation between a believer and a non-believer tends to find one of these ruts. First, let's start with this claim that any one of our religions is true. There are at least two problems with taking this path. The first is they can't all be true. I mean, this is something that Bertrand Russell pointed out 100 years ago. Even if we knew that one of our religions was perfectly true, I mean, even if we knew this was God's multiple choice exam, is it A, Judaism, B, Christianity, C, Islam? Even if we knew one was perfect, given the bewildering profusion of doctrines on offer, and given their mutual incompatibility, every believer should expect damnation purely as a matter of probability. Now it seems to me this should give religious people pause when they espouse their certainties. It never does, but it should. But the deeper problem with arguing for the truth of any religion is that the evidence for our religions is either non-existent or terrible. And this subsumes all claims about the existence of a personal God, the divine origin of certain books, the virgin birth of certain people, the veracity of ancient miracles. I mean, take Christianity as an example. Christianity is founded on the claim that the gospel account of the miracles of Jesus is true. there are certain Christians that may want to hedge their bet here, but most Christians, most of the time, take some complement of these miracles as true, and most important seems to be the resurrection. Now, the problem with this is that the only thing that testifies to these miracles ever having occurred is the gospel. There's no extra biblical description of these events. Everyone agrees that the Gospels were written decades after the events they report, the earliest Gospels. The problem is that even if the evidence were much better than that, even if we had hundreds of contemporaneous eyewitness accounts of these miracles, that would still not be good enough evidence to cash out the claims of Christianity. Why not? Well, the problem is that in the 21st century, reports of miracles are still quite common. I have met literally hundreds of Western-educated men and women who think that their favorite Hindu or Buddhist guru has magic powers. I mean, these are the reports of miracles are quite current. There are Hindu yogis and mystics who reportedly walk on water and raise the dead and fly without the aid of technology and read minds and divine the future. You take someone like Satya Sai Baba, the South Indian guru. All of these miracles are attributed to him. He even claims to have been born of a virgin, which incidentally is not such a rare claim in the history of religion or in history generally. Genghis Khan was supposedly born of a virgin. Alexander the Great was born of a virgin. I mean, parthenogenesis does not guarantee that you're going to turn the other cheek, apparently. So consider this. Satya Sai Baba has these miracles attributed to him by literally thousands upon thousands of living eyewitnesses. He is not the David Koresh of Hinduism. His devotees threw a birthday party for him a few years ago, and 1 million people showed up. There are millions of people who believe he is a living God. Now, so consider, as though for the first time, the foundational claim of Christianity. The claim is that miracle stories of a sort that surround a person like Satya Sai Baba today, and which are compelling to no one apart from his devotees, suddenly become especially credible if you place them in the pre-scientific religious context of the first century Roman Empire, decades after their supposed occurrence. So Satya Sai Baba's miracles don't even merit an hour on the Discovery Channel. And yet, place these miracles in an ancient text, and half the people on this earth think it a legitimate project to organize their lives around them. Does anyone else see a problem with that? All right, so let's leave aside questions of religion's truth. The second way of arguing in defense of God is to say that religion is useful, and so useful that it may be necessary. And the most common way of arguing for its usefulness is to say that it makes people moral, it consoles them, it gives their lives meaning. There are several problems with this line of argument. The first is, as a defense of God's existence, it is a total non sequitur. I mean, the usefulness of religion does not give you the slightest reason to believe that God actually exists. Every religion could function like a placebo. It could be totally barren of real content and yet extremely useful in certain circumstances. Let's say that the cosmologists and the physicists came forward and said, sorry for the misunderstanding. It turns out there is a God, and he does have a plan for you. Let's say that happened. The fact that this idea would be consoling wouldn't provide an additional reason to believe it. I mean, if we have conquered any ground at all in the career of our rationality, it's on this distinction that there is a world of difference between wanting to believe something and having good reasons for believing it. And this is why we have phrases like wishful thinking and experimenter bias. This is why scientists do double-blind controlled studies whenever they can and submit their data for peer review. So that's the crucial piece. When you hear someone arguing for the link between morality and religion, or the fact that it gives people meaning in their lives, this is an argument about the usefulness, and this is not an argument for the plausibility of any specific religious doctrine. The other problem with arguing for the usefulness of religion is that the dangers of religion are testified to now on a daily basis by bomb blasts. I mean, how useful is it that millions of Muslims in this world believe in the metaphysics of martyrdom? How useful is it that the Shia and the Sunni in Iraq have such heartfelt religious differences? How useful is it that so many Jewish settlers think that the creator of the universe promised them a patch of desert on the Mediterranean? How useful has Christianity's anxiety about sex been these last 70 generations? Jews, Christians, and Muslims claim that their holy books are so profound, so prescient of humanity's needs, that they could only have been written under the direction of an omniscient deity. An atheist is simply someone who has considered this claim, read the books, and found the claim to be ridiculous. There is nothing that needs to be presupposed on insufficient evidence in order to reject the biblical God. I mean, what dogma have we all embraced to not take Zeus and Poseidon and Apollo into account on a daily basis? What dogma have we used to reject all of the thousands of dead gods who now lie buried in that mass grave we call mythology? Would it be dogmatic to doubt that the Iliad or the Odyssey was written by the creator of the universe? This is not dogmatism. As Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That is all you need for atheism. I mean, if ever there were an antidote to dogmatism, that's it. There's a related claim, the idea that atheism is arrogant, and science generally is arrogant in its dismissal of religion. This is really ironic. It's this claim reverberates ceaselessly in the echo chamber of American religious discourse. But it is a profound irony to see religious people praising themselves for their humility while essentially making claims about cosmology and physics and astronomy and geology and biology and paleontology and just dozens of specific sciences that no scientist could make. I mean, every religious person who takes the Genesis account of creation, say, seriously, 53% of Americans seemingly take it literally, but just even dignifying it as informative. Any person who's doing this is essentially saying to somebody like Stephen Hawking, Stephen, you're a smart guy. I see you got a lot of equations over there, but you essentially don't know enough about cosmology, because here, God did this in 6 days, and then he rested on the seventh, and I don't really, that could be a metaphor, but I don't see you really grappling with the nuances here, and they're essentially saying to someone like Richard Dawkins or Robert Trivers or any evolutionary biologist, they're saying, you're saying all this stuff about DNA and the fossil record and radiocarbon dating, but it says here that man was made in a separate act of creation, and that really we should ponder over that. And this would be amusing, this kind of covert arrogance, if it were not having such a disastrous effect, if it were not impeding the teaching of science in this country. 30% of biology teachers don't even mention evolution because it is such a hassle to deal with the religious lunacy of their students and their parents. I mean, this really is impeding medical research. It really is eroding the prestige of the United States in the eyes of the rest of the world. You saw this recent Republican debate. You know, when asked, you know, how many of you reject evolution? 3 arms go up. I mean, this is flabbergasting. These people are seeking the highest not only the highest office in the land, they're seeking more power and responsibility than any person has had in human history. So to wrap up, let me just say that none of what I've just said should be construed as a denial of the importance of ethics in our lives, or even the importance of spiritual experience. You can be someone who's deeply committed to transforming your moment-to-moment perception of the world and use techniques like meditation and fasting, and you can go into a cave for a year and be a mystic if you want to. None of that requires presupposing anything on insufficient evidence. And none of that requires that we lie to ourselves or to our children about our state of knowledge about the world. And the problem I have with religion, both at every point on the spectrum, from moderate to extreme, is that it stands as a permanent denial of the possibility of developing a truly rational, modern, open-ended discussion about the nature of our subjectivity, about the possibility of ethics and spirituality truly in conformity with our rationality as it exists now. Every religious person, every person who's committed to still being a Christian or a Jew or a Buddhist is essentially giving tacit endorsement to the religious divisions in our world and essentially saying that we need some measure of mythology, we need some measure of fairy tale, we need to pretend on some occasions that we know things we do not know. And it's simply untrue. So I think that's probably enough to get us started. Thank you.
I'm going to go up there with the podium. Can you do that? Before I begin my critique of Sam and his book, I want to say that we do share one, very important belief, and that is that both of us feel that it's time to stop tolerating the intolerant, and that societies that tolerate the intolerant, that eventually both the tolerant disappear and tolerance along with them. And so I do laud Sam for his courage. And as you heard that Bob said, I just wrote a book on the Christian right called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War in America. So on that, I laud Sam for standing up. But I come from a religious background. I guess in some vague way I still consider myself religious. And I think Sam, in my mind, has conflated faith, which I hold of some importance, with tribalism. I think his book is an attack not so much on faith, but on a system of being and believing that is dangerous and is compatible with the open society. But what he attacks is superstition, a belief in magic, the childish notion of an anthropomorphic God that is characteristic of the tribe, of the closed society. And he calls this religion, and I do not. I think what Sam, in my mind, fails to grasp is not simply the meaning of faith, something that I'll address a little later on, but the supreme importance of the monotheistic traditions in creating the concept of the individual. This individualism, the belief that we can exist as distinct beings from the tribe or the crowd, and that we are called on as individuals to make moral decisions that at times defy the clamor of the tribe or the nation, is a gift of the Abrahamic faiths. This sense of individual responsibility is coupled with the constant injunctions in Islam, Judaism, and Christianity for a deep altruism, and this laid the foundations for the open society. This individualism is the central doctrine and most important contribution of monotheism. We are enjoined, after all, to love our neighbor, not our tribe. This empowerment of individual conscience is the starting point of the great ethical systems of our civilization. The prophets, and here I would include Jesus, helped institutionalize dissent and criticism. They initiated the separation of powers. They reminded us that that culture in society was not the sole prerogative of the powerful, that freedom, and indeed the religious life, required us to often oppose and defy those in authority. God, as Sam points out, is a human concept. God is the name we give to our belief that life has meaning, one that transcends the world's chaos, randomness, and cruelty. To me, to argue about whether God exists or does not exist is futile. The question is not whether God exists. The question is whether we concern ourselves with or are utterly indifferent to the sanctity and ultimate transcendence of human existence. God is that mysterious force, and you can give it many names, as many religions do, which works upon us and through us to seek and achieve truth, beauty, and goodness. And God is perhaps best understood, to steal a line from Tillich, as our ultimate concern, that in which we should place our highest hopes, confidence, and trust. In Exodus, God says by way of identification, I am that I am. And this is probably more accurately translated, I will be what I will be. I think God is better understood as a verb rather than a noun. God is not an asserted existence, but a process accomplishing itself. And God is inescapable. It is the life force that sustains, transforms, and defines all existence. The name of God is laden, thanks to our religious institutions and the numerous tyrants, charlatans, and demagogues these institutions have produced, with so much baggage and imagery that it's hard for us to see the intent behind the concept. The problem is not religion, but religious orthodoxy. Most moral thinkers, from Socrates to Christ to Francis of Assisi, eschewed the written word because they knew, I suspect, that once things were written down, they became, in the wrong hands, codified, and used not to promote morality, but conformity, subservience, and repression. Writing freezes speech. George Steiner calls this the decay into writing. The moment the writers of the gospel set down the words of Jesus, they began to kill it, to kill the message. There is no room for prophets within religious institutions, indeed within any institutions. For as Tillich knew, all human institutions, including the church, are inherently demonic. Tribal societies persecute and silence prophets. Open societies tolerate them at their fringes. And our prophets today come not usually from the church, but from our artists, poets, writers, those who follow their inner authority. Samuel Beckett's voice is one of modernity's most authentically religious. Beckett, like the author of Ecclesiastes, was a realist. He saw the pathetic, empty monuments we spend a lifetime building to ourselves. He knew, as we read in Ecclesiastes, that nothing is certain or permanent, real or unreal, and that the secret of wisdom is detachment without withdrawal, that since death awaits us all is vanity, that we must give up on the childish notion that one is rewarded for virtue or wisdom. Those who deform faith into creeds, who use it as a litmus test for institutional fidelity, root religion in a profane rather than a sacred context. They seek, like all who worship idols, to give the world a unity and coherence it does not possess. They ossify the message, and once ossified, it can never reach an existential level, never rise to ethical freedom, to faith. The more vast the gap between professed faith and acts of faith, the more vast our delusions about our own grandeur and importance, the more intolerant, aggressive, and dangerous we become. Faith is not in conflict with reason. Faith does not conflict with scientific truth unless faith claims to express a scientific truth. Faith can neither be affirmed nor denied by scientific, historical, or philosophical truth. And here I think Sam confuses the irrational, which he sees as part of faith, with the non-rational. There is a reality that is not a product of rational deduction. It is not accounted for by strict rational discourse. There is a spiritual dimension to human existence and the universe, but this is not irrational. It is non-rational. Faith allows us to transcend what Flaubert says was our mania for conclusions, a mania he described as one of humanity's most useless and sterile drives. We are at war with Islam, Sam writes in The End of Faith. It may not serve our immediate foreign policy objectives for our political leaders to openly acknowledge this fact, but it is unambiguously so. It is not merely that we are at war with an otherwise peaceful religion that has been hijacked by extremists. We are at war with precisely the vision of life that is prescribed to all Muslims in the Qur'an and further elaborated in the literature of the Hadith, which recounts the sayings and teachings of the Prophet. Sam assures us that the Qur'an mandates such hatred, that the problem is with Islam itself. He writes that Islam, more than any other religion human beings have devised, has all the makings of a thoroughgoing cult of death. Now, after studying 600 hours of Arabic, spending 7 years of my life in the Middle East, most of them as the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times, I do not claim to be a scholar on Islam. But I know the Qur'an is emphatic about the rights of other religions to practice their own beliefs and unequivocally condemns attacks on civilians as a violation of Islam. The Qur'an states that suicide of any type is an abomination. More importantly, the tactic of suicide bombing was pioneered as a weapon of choice by the Tamils, who are chiefly Hindu, in Sri Lanka long before it was adopted by Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, or Hamas. It is what you do when you do not have artillery or planes or missiles and you want to create maximum terror. I also know from my time in the Muslim world that the vast majority of the some 1 billion Muslims on the planet, most of whom are not Arab, are moderate. To test the violence done in the name of their religion and look at Pat Robertson or Franklin Graham, who demonize Muslims in the name of Christianity with the same horror and fear that we look at Osama bin Laden or the leaders of Hamas. The Palestinian resistance movement only took on radical Islam coloring in the 1990s, when conditions in Gaza and the West Bank deteriorated and thrust people into profound helplessness, despair, and poverty, similar conditions that are empowering the Christian right in our own country. The externalization of evil is used in Sam's book to endorse torture. He, of course, argues that the reason that requires us to waterboard detainees and the physical and moral black holes we have set up to make them disappear comes from the threat of terrorism. He quotes Alan Dershowitz, not only to reassure us that the Israelis treat Palestinians, 400 of whom have been killed in Gaza over the past few months, humanely, but to trot out this notion of a ticking time bomb, the idea that we know a terrorist has planted a large bomb in the center of a city and we must torture him, or in the glib phrase from Sam's book, we must dust off a strappado and expose this unpleasant fellow to a session of bygone times. This reference to torture might be amusing if you have spent your life encased in the protective world of the university. But as someone who was captured and held for a week by Iraqi Republican Guard during the 1991 Shiite uprising in Basra, and then turned over for my final 24 hours to the Iraqi secret police, whom my captors openly expected to execute me, I find this glib talk of physical abuse difficult. Dershowitz and Harris cannot give us a legal or historical precedent where such a case as they describe actually happened. But this is not the point. The point is to endow us as a nation with a moral right to abuse others in the name of a particular version of goodness. This is done in the name of reason. It is done in the name of a false god, an idol. And this god, if you want it named, is the god of death. Or as Freud stated, thanatos, the death instinct, the impulse that works towards the annihilation of all living things, including ourselves. For once you torture, even in the name of reason, even in the name of security, you unleash sadists and killers. You consign human beings to moral oblivion. You become no better than those you oppose. The danger... The point of religion, authentic religion, is not that in the end it is about us. It is about the other, about the stranger lying beaten and robbed on the side of the road, about the poor, the outcasts, the marginalized, the sick, the destitute, about those who are being abused and beaten in cells in Guantanamo and a host of other secret locations, about what we as a society do to gays and lesbians, what we do to the 47 million Americans without health insurance, the illegal immigrants who live among us without rights or protection. Their suffering is as invisible as the suffering of the mentally ill we have relegated to heating grates or prison cells. It is about them. We have forgotten who we were meant to be, who we were created to be, because we have forgotten that we find God not in ourselves, finally, but in our care for our neighbor, in the stranger, including those outside the nation and the faith. The religious life is not designed to make you happy or safe or content. It is not designed to make you whole or complete, to free you from anxieties and fear. It is designed to save you from yourself, to make possible human community, to understand that the greatest force in life is not power or reason, but love. As Niebuhr wrote, nothing worth doing is completed in our lifetime. Therefore, we are saved by hope. Nothing true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Therefore, we are saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we are saved by love. No virtuous act is quite as virtuous from the standpoint of our friend or foe as from our own. Therefore, we are saved by the final form of love, which is forgiveness. Thank you.
I think you guys stated it. I just want to ask a couple of questions, and of course we're going to run out of time. But on the second half of your remarks, I think we could have a discussion about, and we should, how do we perceive the Muslim religion and so forth. So sure, leave that. On the first part, though, I think you avoided the argument of his work because he makes the point that this fundamentalist religion, which you attack, the Christian right and so forth, actually is a more honest position than what you call the liberal theology. At least they believe in revealed truths. They make a claim that there is a God that they invoke, that there are documents that you can refer to. And the religion that you refer to here is one that an atheist can accept quite readily. It's a God of great mystery, interest. I'm not putting it down, but as probably the only one in this room who actually met and interviewed Bertrand Russell, I know some of you regard, you would consider him in that respect a highly religious person, a man who cared a great deal about preventing nuclear war, about freedom in the world, and so forth. So he would be your ideal religious person. But the reason I say it begs the argument is that Sam, in his writing, says that we live in a different world where religion, in fact, is believed in a literal sense, that this is supposed to be revealed truth, and that he has these statistics. I forget the statistics, but 80% believe the earth is only 6,000 years old, and they believe that homosexuals are criminals or should be stoned because it is written somewhere, along with you shouldn't eat shellfish, although that part is forgotten. And it seems to me, and I'm not going for laughs here, it seems to me what Sam has pinpointed is what is actually the religious experience of most Americans. And as he points out in his book, it's not the religious experience of most Europeans, and in fact many different peoples in the world, but in this country, and that's why we call this religion, politics, and the end of the world, the people who actually are president, right? We're talking about some marginal fringe movements. Our politics are controlled by people who believe what those three Republican candidates believe. And they believe, and then you invoke Jesus. Let me put it this question point is. Yet you told me, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I asked you, do we really know whether Jesus even existed? Do we know whether any of the thoughts attributed to Jesus have any basis? And you were quite clear that we don't.
We don't.
We
don't
don't.
have to stop.
So what is the value of invoking Jesus when we have no idea if he ever existed or if any of the ideas attributed to him were ever connected with this person who might not have existed?
Well,
why is it relevant?
First of all, I think that what Sam attacks is tribalism. It is that revealed spiritual truth, which is part of tribal society, which can't be deviated. Religion often lends itself to tribal society, but anything within a closed society or a tribal society is colored by that belief, whether it's the system of government, the patriarchal nature of the family. I mean, and when we look at the radical Christian right in this movement, I, in fact, think it has no religious legitimacy at all. I look at it as a mass movement, and probably the most dangerous mass movement in American history. It is fused. What it's done is fused Christian language and Christian iconography with the language and iconography of American nationalism. I saw the same thing in the Balkans, and that's a toxic and powerful mix. But really, in biblical terms, it is a form of idolatry. Now, the problem with the Bible is, to quote Niebuhr again, religion is a good thing for good people and a bad thing for bad people. You can find anything you want in the Bible, including, it's a document written by over hundreds of years by writers with varying agendas, some of which are morally indefensible. And yet, nevertheless, the ethics that were promoted by in various books in the Bible, the concept of the individual, the concept of the prophets like Amos about justice. I mean, the value of religion for me is that it is the beginning of ethical systems. It's our first struggling with ethics. And the notion that somehow religion itself is defined to those narrow, tribalistic, chauvinistic elements, not that they don't wrap themselves in the name of it, I just think is unfair. I mean, you can read the book of Ecclesiastes, and it could have been written by Becket. I mean, and that's also in the Bible.
It seems to me that you don't think that beliefs really have consequences. I mean, to attribute this to institutions as opposed to what people think seems to me to completely miss the way people behave in this world, why they behave the way they do, why they have the emotional reactions they have, why they perpetrate violence when they do and why they don't. And all I'm arguing for is that beliefs have consequences, and beliefs, religious beliefs, should be subjected to the same kinds of conversational pressures that we subject all other beliefs to, and that this taboo that gives beliefs in the name of God a free ride in our discourse has to be lifted. And so, I mean, you mentioned the second commandment at one point, the commandment against graven images. That commandment was responsible for the Muslim cartoon controversy. I mean, where did Muslims get it into their heads that you could not draw a picture of Muhammad? It is their endorsement of the second commandment. I can assure you that if the Qur'an said, by all means, caricature the prophet to the best of your ability, for this pleases the Lord, there would be no cartoon controversy. You would not have had people by the hundreds of thousands burning embassies and taking hostages, and I think something like 140 people died, and that was just an eruption of egregious medieval stupidity, and it took the form it took because the religion is in the form it's in. People believe that specific tenet about idolatry.
Can I just challenge you on that? Because it's clearly laid out in writing that somehow it's the religion that drives the insanity rather than other factors, and you're quite disparaging of those of us who argue that the religion is grafted on because you dismiss the imperialist argument and the hunt for oil and so forth. And yet, it seems to me that if you look at what has happened in this Arab world, particularly, but generally through the Muslim world, you take someone like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or bin Laden, the people who actually gave us 9/11. They didn't grow organically out of Afghanistan. They were brought there by the CIA. They didn't represent a major religious current in anywhere. If you look at the Muslim Brotherhood coming out of Egypt, they were opposed to Nasser. You look at Hamas in the West Bank, they were opposed to the PLO, which was essentially a secular movement. And then the religious movements, as Chris has written, gain currency because they represent a fighting basis or an alternative when the secularists have failed. And for instance, you, in your writing, defended the invasion of Iraq, which was the invasion of a basically secular country.
But that's actually not true. I've never defended the invasion of Iraq.
Okay, well then I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
But let me, what I thought you defended in your book, and I have the passages, and I don't want to put you on the spot or have you defend the position you don't take, but it seemed to me you had this very broad brush that somehow, what I thought you defended in your book, and I have the passages, and I don't want to put you on the spot or have you defend the position you don't take, but it seemed to me you had this very broad brush that somehow it is the religion that caused the problems. Whereas from my experience in traveling around this part of the world and covering events, the religion became a response to policies pursued by others. And that, I think, if you take Iraq, you have a very good example of that, where for all the failings of Saddam Hussein, it was basically a secular society, and in which women were in a better position than they are now. And to take one example. And I think the point that Chris was making is that when you actually go out and see these societies, the mischief came not from a reading of the Qur'an. The mischief came from very enlightened, rational people, the best and the brightest, who were conducting the foreign policy of advanced nations.
Well, I'm certainly not going to deny that we have caused ourselves problems. And one of the reasons why we have been so inept in our foreign policy, I think, has a lot to do with our own faith-based thinking. The fact that we promote people to positions of power who, you know, in the president's case thinks God put him in the White House, and I've argued that that belief logically entails that God did not put him in the White House to make a catastrophic mistake. So I don't think we want someone making these decisions about when to go to war and when not to go to war who thinks that when he closes his eyes and just kind of tries to get a feeling for what to do, his intuitions just may be vetted by the creator of the universe. And I take these people at their word. I mean, people believe this stuff. So,
okay, but isn't it quite possible that this is just grafted on? You know, the Elmer Gantry phenomenon. I mean, that maybe Falwell and Pat Robertson don't really believe any of this stuff. That they use it to hype their own cause.
It is true that it's possible. Okay, first of all, I think there's a few variables we have to get on the table here. It is certainly possible, and I think this is true, that there is a distance between what people profess they believe and what they actually believe, and what they will say on a questionnaire, and then what is really operative at the level of their behavior. Now, what this distance is, that's something that's difficult to determine in any case. So when you have something like 38% of British Muslims now claim to believe that anyone who leaves the faith, anyone who commits the crime of apostasy, should be put to death. This is 38% of British Muslims. We're not talking about Pakistan or Afghanistan. That's quite an alarming finding. Now, what percentage of them would actually be willing to kill someone who leaves the faith? I don't know. I mean, there's a distance between what you think and what you're actually going to do. But the idea that somehow it is a tiny minority of people who profess these things, who actually believe them, there's no evidence for that. I mean, there is apparently an inexhaustible supply of suicide bombers. People like Chris seem to imagine that the cause of this is not their belief in martyrdom. It's not the idea that you're going to get everything you want after you die, and there's nothing better than death in defense of Islam, which is what I argue. They seem to believe that it is poverty and economic desperation and lack of education. The reason why we know that can't be true is everything we find out about the kinds of people who hijack planes and fly them into buildings or blow themselves up on the tubes in the UK, they are disproportionately well off and they are disproportionately educated. This goes from the top, from people like Osama bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who don't blow themselves up and maybe cynically manipulating people who really believe these things. But it goes all the way down through the 19 hijackers, all of whom were college educated. Many of them had PhDs. It goes to the leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah, and it goes down to the foot soldiers who blow themselves up. Your likelihood of dying if you were affiliated with Hezbollah, dying through suicide bombing, goes up if you're better educated. I mean, and support for suicide bombing goes up in conjunction with literacy. This is not a movement of the poorest of the poor and the least educated. And the idea that it would be nice if it were. I mean, then the remedy is just spread the money around and teach people about all we've come to know in the last 2,000 years. But our situation is quite a bit more sinister than that. It is possible to be someone with the technical expertise, someone who can build a nuclear bomb, and to still think you're going to get 72 virgins in paradise. That's what we should be worried about, that these beliefs really are operative, and the idea that no one believes them while everyone professes them, I think is an act of faith none of us should be willing to adopt.
I'll let Chris respond, but for the people applauding, I just want you to consider one thing. No Muslim has ever used a nuclear weapon, and our own people did. Out of the most advanced, reasonable society, we dropped those bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it really raises a very interesting question, but go ahead.
Well, Sam opens his book with this image of a suicide bomber, and then writes that everybody rejoices and the parents are proud, and it has this cut line at the bottom, the young parents learn his fate, and these are facts. I spent months and months in the Gaza Strip. I went to many of these funerals. In fact, the reality is, the first thing that happens is Hamas not only takes over the house of the bereaved before the body appears, but the entire street. They put plastic chairs out on the dirt street, they run white canopies over the top, and they trot the family out for the Western press. And if the family doesn't say the approved jargon and cant that Hamas wants them to, at the very least they're beaten up, if not worse. Hamas is a totalitarian organization. It shares many characteristics with the radical Christian right of this country, and to defy it is to court violence and death. And I think that this kind of assumption, first of all, that Palestinian mothers don't grieve for their children is really borders on racism. They grieve like any mother, and the notion that, as you write, that they somehow rejoice in the martyrdom of their children is just frankly not true. Having lived in Gaza and been in the houses, I've seen mothers who don't speak for days. The devastation that is visited on parents by the loss of a child is universal, first of all. Second of all, most of the suicide bombers in Gaza do not come from the middle class. They come from the refugee camps. The suicide bombers of 9/11, who I investigated for the New York Times, I covered al-Qaeda based in Paris, in Europe and North Africa after 9/11. They came from the middle class, but it's a very peculiar middle class, because it is a class that is displaced from origin and dropped. You see it with French Muslims, the 5 million Muslims in France. And it is that horrible identity crisis that grips them. And in some ways, they don't belong to any culture. They don't belong in France or Germany, and they don't belong in Tunisia or Algeria or Saudi Arabia, where they come from. And it is that identity crisis that propels them into the arms of radical preachers who promote this utopian vision. It is that search for identity. Finally, in the notion that somehow people in a place like Gaza are propelled to carry out suicide attacks because of religion, I think just, you wouldn't have to spend more than a few days in Gaza to see that Gaza is now virtually one, it's a prison. It's a walled-in prison. People can't travel out. There's severe malnutrition. I think the last figure is over 30%. People are living there on less than $1 a day. There isn't running water. People are sleeping 10 to a room. There's no no employment, no educational system that functions. Of course, now we have a war between Fatah and Hamas on the streets of Gaza City. And these kids have no future. They have no prospects. And the only way they can affirm themselves in this society is through death. They at least know that if they're a shaheed, posters will be put up at their face on the wall. There'll be a huge funeral with several hundred people who fire guns behind them. And what has happened, and that's the tragedy of Oslo. The architects of Oslo, the peace agreement, understood that the engine to build a lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians is economic. It is about giving Palestinians a stake in Israeli economy. It's about that possibility of Ahmed being able to buy a refrigerator and send his child to school. It's what broke the conflict in Northern Ireland. And the Israeli policies, both in the West Bank and Gaza, are becoming more draconian by the day. And of course, they're fueling the very kind of radicalism they're trying to break.
Okay. I need to address this issue of...
Yeah, look, I'll let you address it as lengthy way, but I just want to add a little bit to this. I happened to go to Gaza and the West Bank at the time of the Six-Day War, and I had been in Egypt at the tail end. And I think the consensus was, and I'm not an expert on the area, but the consensus was that the Palestinian population was the least religious of the Arab world. And that the feeling of the people there in Gaza and the West Bank was not driven in any stronger way by religion. And the PLO, as I said before, was basically a secular movement. As, for instance, in Iran, the movement that Mohammad Mossadegh was involved with, a nationalist movement in a country that later became more religious. Egypt, Nasser was a nationalist, later became more religious, and Muslim Brotherhood grew. So since the Qur'an had been written before all this, since the religion was present, how do you explain the rise of this religious feeling, if not in the terms that Chris just explained of desperation and reaction? Why did the PLO, for example, give way to Hamas? Why did these people in Gaza reject basically a secular model of the PLO and embrace Hamas, which was shown in elections and so forth? Why in Iran did they go from a Mossadegh to the Ayatollah? Why in Iraq did they go from basically a secular society to now a society where two major religious factions are contending? It wasn't that the Quran suddenly appeared. It wasn't that the Muslim religion suddenly appeared. It was external events which then caused people to turn to this religion.
Well, no, I think we have... I certainly think the lesson of Iraq is that we underestimated the role of religion. Religion was still a potent force all the time, even while it seemed to be a secular society from the outside. And Saddam Hussein, from the reports I've heard, was quite cognizant of the power of religion and was not nearly as secular as we have made him out to be in the way he marketed himself to his people. I think we are consistently erring on the side of assuming secularism that does not exist in the Muslim world. I need to deal with this charge of racism. It should be pretty easy to see that my criticism of Islam is not racist. First of all, it applies with equal felicity to white Muslims as to any other ethnicity. In some sense, it even applies more to somebody like John Walker Lind, a middle-class guy from Marin County who discovers the Qur'an and decides to go off and fight with the Taliban. It applies more, perhaps, to somebody like Adam Gadon, who comes from Orange County and goes off to be the PR guy for Al-Qaeda, because these guys don't have the alibi of having been brainwashed since infancy by their indigenous Muslim parents. They've adopted this. So there's nothing racist about my criticism of Islam. I am criticizing the logical consequences of certain ideas, and I'm certainly not limiting my criticism of religion to Islam. I just happen to one of the taboos I'm breaking quite consciously in my speaking and writing is I'm noticing that our religions are actually different. I mean, they don't all teach the same thing. And where they do teach the same thing, they don't teach it equally well. I mean, we are not going to have a problem with Jain suicide bombers, no matter how mistreated Jains become in this world. The core principle of Jainism really is nonviolence. I mean, no matter how crazy you get as a Jain in terms of your religion, you're going to become less and less violent. I mean, there's no way you can justify any sort of violence by recourse to the principles of Jainism. To argue that the core principle of Islam is nonviolence is truly impossible. I mean, if anything, the core principle of Islam is jihad. It is convert, subjugate, or kill the infidel. I mean, the Qur'an and the Hadith do nothing so eloquently as demonize the infidel and talk about the imperative of spreading the faith. If you look at the historical example of Muhammad, he's rather a different character than Jesus. He is not a hippie who got crucified. He was a conquering general, and Muslims draw a lot from that example.
You know,
And let me just add one more thing. Another piece that I find rather galling about this mode of apologizing for Islam, and certainly that raising the bogeyman of racism. One of my primary concerns, whenever I criticize Islam, one of the first things I say is that nobody is suffering under Islam more than Muslims. I mean, and certainly nobody's suffering more than Muslim women. And so to obfuscate, to call it racist to criticize this faith, which has I mean, the record of religion in general in terms of the treatment of women is horrifying. I mean, the great geniuses of the Abrahamic tradition thought about the riddle of womanhood, and they gave us this cult of virginity, the forced marriages, bride burning, honor killing. I mean, it is the fact that somebody like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a Somali woman who became a Dutch parliamentarian and now is arguably one of the most hunted people on this planet because of her criticism of Islam, the idea that she has to deal with a multiculturalist criticism of her insensitivity to Islam, and this is a woman who has been, circumcised is a euphemism for it, hunted, had her collaborator butchered in the street in Amsterdam, and now she is a recipient of the same kind of criticism. It is obscurantism. Our religions are different.
Well, if I had a Hebrew Bible here, I could read you passages that are just as distasteful.
I quote them in my book.
So the notion that somehow, because those passages, there are hateful passages in the Qur'an, which they are, is used as a tool to demonize Islam, holds no more validity than demonizing Judaism. I mean, those passages are in both books. And I think that the difference is, and this is, I'm just going to read a couple sentences from your book, where you talk about how to deal with the Islamic world. It's not a matter merely of condemning their religion. You write, it seems all but certain that some form of benign dictatorship will generally be necessary to bridge the gap. But benignity is the key, and if it cannot emerge from within a state, it must be imposed from without. The means of such imposition are necessarily crude. They amount to economic isolation, military intervention, whether open or covert, or some combination of both. While this may seem an exceedingly arrogant doctrine to espouse, it appears we have no alternatives. We cannot wait for weapons of mass destruction to dribble out of the former Soviet Union, to pick only one horrible possibility and into the hands of fanatics. What you're doing is using this demonization of Islam to justify the intervention and occupation of Muslim countries. And as we can see from Iraq, it's not a good idea.
Well, first of all, your point about the Hebrew Bible, I think, speaks to my side of the argument. First of all, I don't shy away from quoting the Hebrew Bible to the exasperation of Christians and Jews when I criticize faith. I think books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy are the most terrible books. I mean, the killing never stops in these texts. The difference
But you
is,
don't think that Jewish mothers are educating their children in that
they are
tradition?
not. They are,
And you have, if I
Well,
dare say,
they
if
are
I
not
dare
with-
say, if I dare say, some. We have some Jewish fanatics. One killed Rabin, remember? So
Well,
some-
one walked
some-
into a mosque in Hebron and shot
yeah,
39
so some
people
are doing it,
kneeling in
but
prayer.
I think just to join the argument, and I'll give you all the time you want on this, the argument that Hedges has made, at least that I'm making, I can't speak for Hedges, is that there are all these Muslims out there who are not teaching their kids this interpretation of the Qur'an any more than most Jewish mothers are, okay? I mean, I've traveled in Indonesia, I've traveled in a lot of these places. That was not the norm. It was not the norm in Palestine. It was not the norm, evidently, in Iraq before we invaded, okay, as far as we can see. It was not the norm, you know. In fact, I don't think we've still had one Iraqi suicide bomber go somewhere else outside of Iraq to blow up anything. These people actually came from Saudi Arabia, remember, which was one of the places we liked. So it seems to, I think that, no, I don't want to beg the question here, which is the Quran has existed, okay? And this primitive interpretation, as there is obviously Christianity, as there is obviously in Judaism. The question is, why does it get triggered at certain moments?
well, I think it has been triggered continuously. And the difference, I might point out, is the spread of destructive technology. I mean, this is why we have to be so worried about these apocalyptic visions of life that essentially tell people that death is an illusion, and in fact, you get everything you want after you die, and that human history is going to end in some kind of glorious conflagration where the good people, if you're a Christian, are going to be brought up into the sky and allowed to witness this rather sacred end to human history. This is believed by people on all sides, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish, some subset of each. And when you marry that to our technological capacity, which is not going away. I mean, we're not going to uninvent the knowledge about how to make weapons of mass destruction. It becomes an increasingly dangerous situation. I'm not soft-pedaling the role of Judaism and Christianity and other religions in this, and I'm not soft-pedaling the role of tribalism generally. Yes, we have to outgrow tribalism. We have to outgrow racism and nationalism. But these are all ideas. And what I find troubling here is the dismissal of the power of ideas. I mean, just imagine what's wrong with this argument. Okay, imagine going to Nazi Germany in the 30s and saying, you know, Sam, your criticism of Nazism is really misplaced. It's not. The problem is not Nazism. It's extremist Nazism. You know, most Nazis are good people. Most Nazis don't spend a lot of time thinking about the purity of German blood. They're not. I mean, they're just, you know, they're these nice grandmothers who love to see their grandchildren in those youth camps with their shirts off, and you've seen those rallies. All those people have these great leather trench coats, and you know, I mean, some of our great sartorial gains were actually Nazi gains, and we shouldn't dismiss that. There's a lot of exuberance and joy in Nazism, and you have used extremism. You've used extremists like Hitler and Goebbels and Himmler to represent the whole, and that. Okay, well, it's not. Nazism is a political ideology. Okay, but we can talk about the principles around which people have rallied, and what they say to one another about how they define themselves as different from other human beings. And religion gives immense motivation to this, and it is the only kind of tribalism in which people posit a transcendental difference between themselves and other people, where in-group and out-group becomes of consequence not only for this life, but for eternity. And to minimize the role that's playing. I mean, I am not imagining the link between Islam and violence, to take Islam as one example, because the people who are perpetrating this violence are telling us ad nauseum why they are doing this. I mean, this kind of analysis it's like going into a church on Sundays and seeing people lined up to receive the Eucharist and asking them why they're doing this, and they tell you about the transubstantiation and their love for Jesus. And to discount all of that, we can't trust what they're saying. Actually, this is just cracker-eating behavior, and it as witnessed by the fact that it happens in other contexts. I mean, people eat crackers in other contexts, and there's a general love of crackers. And so you can't say that
Sam,
people are being motivated by their religion.
Sam, well, this may be good fun. You have to explain why this religion takes hold at certain moments and does not at others. The fact is, if the power...
I reject that analysis.
No, but if the power is in the religion, and you say it's there in the Hebraic religion, only it's not operating now, because Jewish mothers are not doing that. And we know in large parts of the Muslim world it's not operating. They don't read the Qur'an that way. They don't follow the religion that way, including large parts of the Arab world through much of the history. And then you have the example of Ireland, which was mentioned before, where you have Protestants and Catholics reading what should be the same text and killing each other for well over a century. It seems to me you're begging the question of why does it occur at certain moments and not at others? And you're saying it's in the text. If it's in the text, then it should occur all the time. Well, the Qur'an was there in Egypt when it was secular, and it's there when the religious movements come along.
I think it has occurred all the time. To answer your question in two parts, why is it not happening to the same degree among Jews and Christians at this moment? When you look at the history of Christianity and Judaism, and I'm not minimizing the role they're playing now, most of my writing is about not Islam, but about Christianity at this point. Christianity and Judaism have suffered a harrowing collision with modernity over the last 200 years. I mean, they have just had their religions mastered by science and secular politics and common sense to a degree that has not occurred in the Muslim world. The Muslim world has not had a reformation, and it has not had a renaissance. The Muslim world is amazingly isolated from the currents of criticism that have beaten back the fascistic and insane practice of religion that endured for centuries under Christendom. I mean, we were burning witches alive and heretics for 500 years in Europe. We're not doing that anymore, courtesy of scientific understanding of medicine, for one thing. I mean, we don't believe now that people are dying because their neighbor cast a spell on them. That's a good thing. That was hard fought, that battle.
You're talking about practices in a pre-modern society, and you know, when people don't understand the cosmos and they don't understand human bodies, irregardless of religion, and you can read, you know, what anthropologists write from New Guinea or anywhere else when they deal with a pre-modern society, that's how they react. But to somehow blanket, you know, 1 billion people as pre-modern. I lived in Cairo. It's one of the most artistically and intellectually vibrant cities I've ever been in.
Let me just make it very clear. I'm not doing that. I'm not saying that all 1.4 billion Muslims are Al-Qaeda. Okay, I'm not saying that. And there's no doubt that some significant percentage of Muslims don't take their religion all that seriously. That is a good thing. I mean, so that they're moderate. They're moderate because they're not forcing their kids into madrasas and seeing everything through the prism of theology.
Sam,
but the point is, so are we just disagreeing about sheer numbers, or are you denying that any subset of the Muslim world really believes what they say?
I'm saying that what you describe is how a pre-modern group or society exists anywhere on the planet, not just Muslims. That's how pre-modern societies work. That's how tribal societies work. They're superstitious. Honor killings, by the way, having lived in the Middle East for 7 years, are not that common. But let me talk a little bit about the mood of the Muslim world. I was in the Arab world after 9/11, covering Al-Qaeda, and there was absolute revulsion and shock and empathy for us for what happened. The chief Sunni Islamic leader Sheikh Tantawi and Al-Azhar in Cairo condemned the attacks of 9/11 as a crime against humanity, and then went on to denounce Osama bin Laden as a fraud, somebody who had no theological training and no right to issue fatwas or religious edicts. The tragedy is not the fault of the Muslim world. What happened is that we fail to understand that the only way to fight terrorism is to isolate terrorists within their own society, not to begin dropping iron fragmentation bombs all over the Middle East. And what we did as a society was become tribal. We drank that dark elixir of American nationalism, which is not only a form of self-exaltation, but a form of racism. And anybody who didn't support us, including the French, including people who share our values and are our allies. Remember all the jokes about French culture and French identity? You know, let's remember the French were right. There were no weapons of mass destruction. He wasn't tied to Al-Qaeda. And let me finish.
Okay,
Sam.
but you're arguing against positions I don't necessarily hold.
I'm talking about the characteristic of the Muslim in the Arab world, which does not fit with the picture you're painting. And if we had had the courage to be vulnerable, if we had realized that this was a war of shadows, an intelligence war, we would have a huge percentage of the Muslim world on our side. And I can tell you that because I was on the streets of Tunisia, Cairo, Beirut. I was there.
Right. Well,
so let me just finish.
I'll give you a chance.
Okay. You talk about, you know, you dismiss this notion that somehow despair is unimportant, that these people react like barbarians because of the Qur'an. You know, if you go back and read the great philosophers on totalitarianism, on Nazi Germany, Hannah Arendt, Karl Popper, Fritz Stern, The Politics of Cultural Despair, they all write that what propelled the fascists forward, that what propels all totalitarian movements, and I include fundamentalists, Jewish fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists, Islamic fundamentalists, Hindu fundamentalists. Karen Armstrong has done great work on this. What propels them forward is despair, personal and economic despair. And you see it within the United States, with the Weimarization of the American working class, the rise of an American oligarchy, the huge disparities that are creating. You can't maintain a democracy in an oligarchic state. And what's at fault in the Arab world is not Islam, but scummy little dictatorships like the one run in Saudi Arabia or Hosni Mubarak's in Egypt. It's the political system that keeps most people crushed under their heel. Egypt is a deeply repressive state, which we give $3 billion a year to. And let's also finally not forget that every time Israel sends those F-16 jets and Apache helicopters to strike refugee camps in Gaza, the fragments of those bombs have Dayton, Ohio, and other cities on them. And we are complicitous very much in the suppression and abuse and killing of innocent Muslims.
Okay, well, let me deal with your taking the measure of the Muslim world. Happily, we do not assess public opinion by having New York Times journalists go out and live in the Muslim world and make friends and get a vibe. I mean, this is not a single well-run opinion poll would be worth 1,000 years of you wandering around the Middle East.
Well, come on.
No. Okay, how many? That's not wrong, meant to be hyperbolic.
Wrong.
Well, let me tell you.
How many? You can't possibly believe that about polls, Mike.
Well, all we've got are conversations. All we've got are conversations.
Man's lived there for 15 years, for God's sake.
How many people did you ask? How many people did you ask?
I've done it for 2 hours. How long, you know? Go on.
How many people did you ask whether they supported suicide bombing? You know, you could have lived there a long time and asked that question a lot and still not have done anything like the job that Pew did when they went into 9 countries and got a random sample, insofar as that was possible, of Muslims and asked 38,000 people that question. Okay, the responses were appalling. And the responses were appalling in countries that were the most cosmopolitan and the least benighted by pre-modern standards. I mean, this is, and there has been poll after poll after poll. None of them support this sanguine idea of Muslim public opinion.
I actually studied the Pew poll carefully, and what it said was that in the face of an occupation, where the occupier is hurting your country and your people, that this is a legitimate attack because you don't have alternatives. That's what the Pew poll said.
It's in my book if you want to see the question. And the question was, do you support suicide bombing against non-combatants in defense of Islam? Okay. It is explicitly a religious formulation of it. And it's suicide bombing, which, as Chris points out, there is a single line in the Qur'an which seems to suggest suicide is a bad idea. It's suicide bombing against non-combatants. And the support is astonishing. And the support is not... I mean, it's interesting to consider what level of support we would find consoling. You know, 2%, 5%, 10%. Well, I mean, 10% is still 140 million people in this world. But there were countries where it was 75% and 80%. And Turkey, the great Muslim success story, was down around 20%. So these are not...
Can I ask you just a question? I don't want to get people too angry, but I'll kick myself going out of here if I don't ask this question. But we had this war in Vietnam, and according to McNamara, 3.4 million people died. Died. Most of them civilians. Right? Most of them civilians. Is there a fundamental difference between killing 3.4 million people with this carpet bombing and Agent Orange or fragmentation bombs and suicide bombing? Is there a fundamental difference between suicide bombing and destroying Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and all of the wood-based cities of Japan in World War II? Is there a fundamental moral difference?
Well, I think that I don't want to speak for a moment in defense of Vietnam or even in defense of Hiroshima and things that could be given a plausible rationale for self-preservation. I think we could not fight war the way we fought war in World War II. We could not firebomb Dresden because we have too much information, because this information plays upon our nascent feelings of compassion, and that's a good thing. I think we should have all the information we can get about the horrors of war so as to inoculate us against going casually onto the battlefield. But yes, suicide bombing is, when you think about it, something that really should be impossible. And it is the least rational thing, even worse than suicide bombing, celebrating these suicidal atrocities of your children, which, Chris, I understand the mothers you have met didn't appear to be doing that, but there's no question that some mothers do that, and this has been widely reported. If you really believe, it's a perfectly rational thing to feel. If you really believe that martyrdom is true, if you really believe that your dead child, who was there a moment ago, is now in paradise waiting for you and you will really be reunited, death is an illusion. And there are people who believe this, and there are people who express this belief violently in conflicts that have nothing to do with us. I mean, the war between Iran and Iraq was characterized on the Iranian side by this massive campaign of suicide bombing, where teenagers were just goaded out to clear minefields by their parents. We weren't involved. This is not, the problem is not urban sprawl and NAFTA and the other degradations that Chris suggests lead people to despair. There's no doubt that despair is a variable, but it matters what you believe in your despair. And again, I would take you back to despairing Janes. They're not going to practice suicide bombing because they believe something different.
Okay, we have to wind this up because otherwise the overtime costs will bankrupt Truthdig and we won't be able to have another event. But I do want to, I know you guys, you'll be going in the car and you'll see, that thing got all screwed up, Cher was a lousy moderator, et cetera, et cetera. So why don't you go first and then you go second, and just tell us what we didn't get to that we should have, and put the cap on it.
I think that what Sam is fundamentally talking about is fundamentalism, especially this radical fundamentalism that we see within the Muslim world, that we see it within Jewish groups, certainly within the settler movement in Israel. We see it with Hindu nationalists. Fundamentalism, for me, is born out of desperation and despair. That's why it's growing as a movement. I think at its core, it's primarily secular because its objective is the assumption of power at the expense of others. And I think that finally the only way to fight these movements, both abroad and within our own country, is essentially to re-enfranchise these people within our societies. And if we don't re-enfranchise these people, if we allow our country to become a corporate or oligarchic state, the despotism that we watch deforming lives abroad will deform lives at home.
Well, let me give you a sense of what it's like to be me having this conversation. I mean, it seems to me we could have been having this conversation 500 years ago. And life was difficult 500 years ago. There was a lot of despair. There were crops failed and disease spread, and people suffered just instantaneous and catastrophic changes in their fortune. And it was the cause of all of this actually was well understood 500 years ago. It was witchcraft. And happily, the church had produced some very energetic men who had the gumption to deal with this problem. And so every year, some hundreds and sometimes thousands of women were burned alive for casting spells on their neighbors. Now, imagine what it would be like to be among the 5 or the 10% of people at most who recognize that the very belief in magic, the very belief in witchcraft, the very belief in good witches or bad witches was a malignant fantasy. That the white witches who were helping people with medicinal herbs and practicing midwifery, they were on no firmer ground than the black witches who were casting the evil eye. The whole belief system was at fault. Imagine the kind of criticism you're going to get. No, your problem is just with kind of fundamentalist witchcraft. The reality is that witchcraft is far more nuanced than that, and there's no conflict between science and witchcraft. I mean, science deals with physical law and physical causality, but witchcraft deals with potent spells and the internal connections between things. This idea that somehow we shouldn't call into question these patently bad ideas for fear of offending people, for fear of glossing over their despair, for fear of not criticizing other problems in the world. I would never argue that religion is the only problem in the world or the only source of human conflict, but it is a source, and we are mightily attached to it, emotionally attached to it. And we are loath to criticize it even when it is declaring its ugliest intentions and its ugliest certainties. The problem with the Bible is however you pick and choose, whether you're a literalist or a selective literalist, the problem is there's just a mountain of divisive nonsense in there, and that's where people get ideas about homosexuality being an abomination and why our country in the 21st century debates gay marriage as though it were the great moral issue of our time. This is coming from religion, and it seems to me that it's time we had an honest conversation about that.
Let me,